History teaches us that empires fall slowly, years of decay, endless wars, economic collapse. But that is a lie we tell ourselves to feel safe, because sometimes empires change in minutes. This is the story of a battle that lasted 17 minutes, shorter than most modern coffee breaks, yet altered the fate of an empire so completely that historians later tried to pretend it was insignificant. It wasn't. It was buried. The clash took place at dawn, in a place few textbooks mention by name. No grand speeches, no heroic last stands, no decisive victory declared that day. Just 17 minutes of chaos, and a decision that could never be undone. At the time, it was labeled a minor engagement, a footnote, an administrative inconvenience. But within weeks, borders shifted. Within months, alliances collapsed. Within years, an empire that had stood for centuries began to fracture from the inside. And it all traced back to those 17 minutes. The soldiers involved did not know they were making history. They thought it was a routine maneuver. So did the generals. That is what makes this story dangerous, because the battle did not change the empire by force. It changed it by exposure. On the morning of the clash, two forces met unexpectedly. Neither side had planned to fight. Orders were unclear. Communication lines failed. A single officer whose name would later be quietly removed from records made a split-second decision to advance instead of retreat. That decision lasted 17 minutes. When the firing stopped, fewer than 100 men were dead. By historical standards, that was nothing. But something else had died with them: the illusion of control. Within those 17 minutes, the empire revealed a weakness it had spent decades denying. A flaw in command, a hesitation at the center, a fracture between what was ordered and what was obeyed. And once that weakness was seen, it could never be unseen. Reports from the battlefield were delayed, then edited, then rewritten. Timelines were altered. Names were omitted. Maps were redrawn. Official histories described the event as inconclusive, but internal correspondence told a different story. One officer wrote, "If word of this spreads, we will lose more than territory." Another warned, this was not a defeat of arms, it was a defeat of certainty. The empire survived the day, but it never fully recovered from the moment. Because power does not disappear when armies lose. Power disappears when people realize it can. 17 minutes were enough. Enough for doubt to spread. Enough for rivals to notice. Enough for subjects to stop believing the myth. This is not the story of a great battle. It is the story of a small one that history was afraid to remember. And once you understand what happened in those 17 minutes, you will never look at empires the same way again. The morning of the 17-minute battle began with confusion, not aggression. Both forces were operating under outdated intelligence. Couriers had been delayed. Signal lines were unreliable. Maps used by field commanders contradicted the maps held by headquarters. In other words, no one was exactly sure where the border was anymore. The empire's troops had been ordered to hold position, not advance, not provoke, simply observe and report. Their presence was meant to be symbolic, a reminder of authority rather than an act of force. But symbols only work when everyone agrees what they mean. At approximately 6:41 a.m., scouts reported unexpected enemy movement less than a kilometer away. The report was sent up the chain of command. It was never answered. The reason would later become clear. The communication officer responsible had already forwarded a contradictory message from a different unit, creating a deadlock. Headquarters hesitated. Field commanders waited. Minutes passed. Then came the moment that changed everything. A junior officer, newly promoted, untested, and anxious to prove competence, interpreted the silence as approval. He ordered a limited forward maneuver, not an attack, just movement. 17 minutes later, the empire would regret that distinction. The opposing force saw the movement and assumed the worst. Their own orders were similarly unclear. They responded not with diplomacy but with fire. The first shots were not aimed to kill, they were warning shots. But warnings sound identical to attacks when nerves are tight and fingers are already on triggers. Within seconds, the field erupted. Small arms returned fire. Chaos. Officers on both sides attempted to halt the engagement almost immediately. Whistles were blown. Flags were raised. Messengers ran. But once gunfire starts, it does not obey hierarchy. It obeys fear. During those 17 minutes, at least 3 separate ceasefire orders were issued. None of them reached the front line in time. By the time a clear command finally arrived from Imperial headquarters, cease all engagement, immediately the damage had already been done. The junior officer who gave the initial order tried to countermand it. Too late. Men were already down, positions compromised, lines crossed, and most critically, the illusion of centralized control had been shattered in full view of both armies. When the firing stopped, silence fell as suddenly as it had begun. 17 minutes, that was all it took. Later reviews would focus obsessively on those orders, who sent them, who delayed them, who misinterpreted them, but they missed the larger truth. The empire did not fail because of a bad order. It failed because its orders no longer arrived in time. An empire that cannot act decisively even for 17 minutes is an empire already slipping. Official reports describe the 17-minute battle in sterile terms: limited engagement, minimal casualties, rapid disengagement. But soldiers remember things differently. For the men on the ground, those 17 minutes felt endless, not because of the violence, but because of the uncertainty. No one knew who had started it. No one knew if it would stop. No one knew what it meant. A private later wrote in a letter that was never mailed, "We kept waiting for the order that would explain why we were shooting." Some soldiers fired high, deliberately missing. Others froze. A few advanced without realizing they had crossed a line no map clearly defined. The enemy. Soldiers looked just as confused. There were moments when men on opposite sides locked eyes, hesitating, both waiting for someone else to decide whether this was a war or a mistake. One veteran recalled hearing an officer shout, "Hold your fire, this isn't it." But it had already started. The most damaging thing the soldiers witnessed was not bloodshed, it was indecision. Officers arguing in the open, messengers running in circles, orders being contradicted seconds after being given. That sight mattered more than casualties. Because soldiers can forgive loss, they cannot forgive confusion. In those 17 minutes, rank lost meaning, confidence drained away. Men began making individual decisions instead of following commands. That behavior did not end when the firing stopped. It lingered. Back in camp, soldiers talked quietly. They noticed how easily the chain of command had broken, how quickly authority dissolved once clarity vanished. One corporal wrote in his diary, "If they don't know what they want, why should we pretend they do?" That question spread faster than any enemy force. It moved through tents, through barracks, through regiments that never even heard gunfire. The battle itself was brief. The idea it created was permanent. From that morning on, soldiers stopped believing that every order was deliberate, that every movement was planned, that every border was solid. They began to see the empire not as a machine but as a collection of people improvising under pressure. And machines can fail. This realization did not cause immediate rebellion. It caused something more dangerous: hesitation. The next time orders came late, soldiers waited. The next time commands conflicted, they questioned. The next time leadership hesitated, they noticed. 17 minutes had taught them a lesson no enemy propaganda ever could. The empire was not omniscient, it was guessing. And once soldiers see that, no uniform can hide it again. By the evening of the 17-minute battle, The Empire's leadership understood one thing clearly: what happened could not be allowed to stand. As written, initial field reports were chaotic. Timelines contradicted each other. Some units claimed they were attacked, others insisted they were responding to provocation. A few admitted carefully that they had acted without direct authorization. None of that was acceptable, so the reports were recalled, rewritten, sanitized. A special review committee was assembled not to investigate responsibility, but to restore narrative control. The goal was simple: make the incident small enough to forget. Casualty numbers were adjusted downward. The word battle was replaced with skirmish. The duration was rounded off. 17 minutes became a brief exchange. Most importantly, the question of who gave the first order was removed entirely. One draft of the report contained a sentence that never made it to the final version. Command authority was momentarily unclear. That sentence was struck out in red ink because admitting momentary uncertainty was more dangerous than admitting defeat. Maps were redrawn to suggest the clash occurred in disputed territory rather than Imperial ground. This allowed officials to frame the incident as an unavoidable border misunderstanding, rather than a failure of command. The junior officer who initiated the advance was reassigned. Not punished, not promoted, reassigned. His name vanished from subsequent documents. Within a year, he resigned from service altogether. No formal explanation was given. Internally, however, the damage could not be edited out. Private correspondence between high-ranking officials revealed panic. One senior administrator wrote, "If allies learn how quickly our lines acted without orders, they will test us." Another warned, "This incident must not become a precedent," but it already had, because while the public record was cleaned, the memory of the event lived on among officers and soldiers alike. They knew the truth. They had seen the hesitation. They had felt the delay. They had acted in the absence of clarity. The rewritten report restored order on paper. It did not restore confidence, and confidence once crack spreads its fractures invisibly. The Empire believed it had contained the incident. In reality, it had only ensured that the lesson would be learned quietly and applied later, by others, in moments far more dangerous than 17 minutes. The Empire's greatest mistake was believing that silence meant secrecy. It didn't. It meant delay. Foreign observers, military attaches, traitors, diplomats were not reading the sanitized report. They were listening to rumors, watching troop movements, and comparing what was said with what didn't happen next. And they noticed something immediately. The Empire did not retaliate. No counter-mobilization. No escalation. No show of force to reassert authority. For an empire that prided itself on swift, overwhelming responses, that restraint was suspicious. One rival general reportedly said, "If this were nothing, they would have overreacted." Instead, the Empire hesitated. Borders were reinforced quietly rather than publicly. Patrols increased but without announcements. Orders became cautious, defensive, layered with qualifiers. Rivals understood what that meant. The center was uncertain. Within weeks, neighboring powers began probing not with armies, but with questions. Diplomatic demands grew sharper. Trade negotiations stalled. Border patrols edged closer to contested areas, watching for response times. Each probe was met with careful deliberation, too careful, and each careful response confirmed the same thing. The Empire was afraid of acting too fast. Again, 17 minutes had taught its leadership a lesson, but rivals learned a different one. They learned the Empire could be hesitated into paralysis. One intelligence report from a neighboring state described the situation bluntly. Command delay exceeds acceptable thresholds. Exploit windows before correction. The correction never fully came, because to correct the problem would require admitting it existed, and that was impossible. The Empire's strength had always been its image of inevitability. Orders flowed outward. Compliance flowed inward. The system worked because everyone believed it did. The 17-minute battle introduced doubt. Rivals didn't need proof. They needed timing. And timing was exactly what the empire had lost. Small incidents followed. Border disputes that lingered. Alliances that demanded reassurance. Local uprisings that were addressed slowly, carefully. Each response took longer than expected. Each delay reinforced the pattern. The empire still looked powerful, but it no longer felt decisive. And in geopolitics, perception is often more lethal than force. Citizens would not understand the consequences for years, but rivals began adjusting strategy. Immediately, they did not attack. They waited. Because once an empire shows it can hesitate, 17 minutes is all anyone needs to test it. Again, for the empire's citizens, life continued as normal. Taxes were collected. Parades were held. New decrees were announced with familiar confidence. Nothing appeared broken. But beneath the surface, the 17-minute battle had started a chain reaction, quiet, delayed, and devastating. The first sign came not at the border, but in administration. Regional governors began requesting clarification more often. Orders that once would have been executed immediately were now followed by questions. Confirm, proceed as written, await further instruction. Each request added minutes, then hours, then days. The center responded carefully, afraid of another misstep. That caution multiplied. By the time directives reached the edges of the empire, they were outdated. Situations had changed. Local commanders were forced to improvise. Improvisation became habit, and habit became culture. In previous decades, the empire punished initiative. Discipline mattered more than creativity. The system worked because everyone moved in one direction at one speed. After the 17 minutes, that rhythm broke. Officers remembered the battle. They remembered how acting without orders had caused disaster, but they also remembered how waiting for orders had caused it too. So they chose a third option: delay. One internal audit later revealed something shocking. Average response time for military decisions had increased by 38% within 2 years of the incident. No single reform caused it. No law mandated it. It happened organically. Fear does not need policy. It only needs memory. Civil administrators noticed similar patterns. Infrastructure projects stalled. Emergency responses slowed. Disputes that once would have been resolved swiftly were passed upward, then sideways, then back down. Responsibility blurred. Everyone was waiting for someone else to decide. The empire still had armies. It still had wealth. It still had territory. What it was losing was momentum. Historians later called this period the quiet stall. No collapse, no revolution, just hesitation. And hesitation is contagious. Local leaders learned they could push boundaries politically, economically, culturally because responses would be slow and measured. The center no longer frightened them. It negotiated. That shift mattered more than any battle, because empires are not held together by force alone. They are held together by the belief that decisions will be swift, certain, and unavoidable. 17 minutes had shattered that belief, and every delayed response afterward was an echo of that morning, proof that the empire had never truly recovered. By the time historians could clearly see the empire weakening, no enemy army had delivered the final blow. There was no single decisive war, no dramatic invasion, no burning capital. What happened instead was far more unsettling. The empire began to lose without fighting. Rivals stopped challenging it directly. They no longer needed to. They had learned something from the 17-minute battle, and from every delayed response afterward. The empire could be exhausted by indecision. Border states began acting independently. They signed trade agreements without waiting for approval. They negotiated security arrangements. Quietly, when the center objected, it did so politely and too late. Local military commanders learned to interpret silence as permission, just as that junior officer had. Only this time, the consequences were political, not explosive. A provincial governor once delayed sending tax revenue to the capital for 3 months. When questioned, he cited unclear fiscal guidance. The response from the center arrived weeks later, carefully worded, non-punitive, requesting clarification. The money never fully arrived, and nothing happened. That moment spread faster than any battle report. Officials realized enforcement had slowed. Punishment required certainty, and certainty was exactly what leadership now avoided. The empire still issued laws, but laws without enforcement become suggestions. Military alliances frayed. Smaller states tested limits, withdrawing support from joint operations. When the empire objected, it did so diplomatically, never decisively. Even within the capital, officials noticed a change. Meetings stretched longer, decisions were postponed. Committees were formed to review situations that once required immediate action. Every delay was justified. Every hesitation was rational. Together, they were fatal. An empire does not collapse when it is defeated. It collapses when everyone realizes it can be ignored. And that realization traced back not to a great war but to 17 minutes, where no one was certain who was in charge. By the time the empire finally attempted reform, it was too late. Authority cannot be rebuilt quickly. Trust cannot be demanded. It must be believed. And belief, once broken, does not return just because leaders ask for it. The empire did not fall in flames, it faded, quietly, administratively, exactly the way it had been wounded. Empires love long stories, centuries of conquest, generations of rulers, grand causes and heroic endings. But the truth is crueler. Sometimes history turns on moments so small, they almost escape notice. The 17-minute battle was one of those moments, not because of how many died, not because of land gained or lost, but because it exposed something every empire fears being seen: uncertainty. In those 17 minutes, the empire did not lose a fight, it lost its aura. The belief that someone, somewhere, always knew what to do. Once that belief cracked, everything else followed. Orders slowed, decisions softened, authority blurred. The empire still existed on maps long after the battle. Its flags still flew, its officials still spoke with confidence. But beneath the surface, the damage remained. 17 minutes taught soldiers that commands could arrive too late. 17 minutes taught rivals that patience could defeat strength. 17 minutes taught administrators that delay carried no punishment. And 17 minutes taught history a dangerous lesson. Power does not vanish when it is challenged. It vanishes when it hesitates. The battle was forgotten not because it was unimportant but because it was too revealing. To acknowledge it would mean admitting that empires are fragile not at their borders, but at their centers. That a single moment of indecision can ripple outward for decades. Today, historians still argue about which empire this story belongs to. Records were rewritten, names changed, locations blurred, but the lesson remains timeless. No empire collapses in one day. Some collapse in 17 minutes and spend the next 50 years pretending nothing happened. If you ever wonder how great powers fall without a final battle, remember this story. Remember the clash that lasted less than half an hour. And remember that sometimes, history's most powerful turning points are the ones no one dares to remember.